Okay, good evening, everyone. We're going to kick it off and welcome to our second of our series of Nature of Change webinars here, where we're exploring the change over time of our very wonderful Port Phillip Bay and the people that rely and depend on the bay. So tonight we have some really special guest speakers that we're going to be introducing to you very shortly. And they're going to be speaking on the changes in terms of the changes and values of our incredible marine ecosystems that lie beneath the surface of Port Phillip Bay. The values, threats, challenges, and diving into our marine sanctuaries as well as the water quality impacts on these ecosystems and also the human health. So these events are a collaboration between Lifesaving Victoria, the Association of Bayside Municipalities, and the Victorian National Parks Association. And we've also got a really cool event, a field trip actually event coming up that we're going to announce right at the end. So definitely stay tuned and don't jump off early if you want to get a special glimpse into what that event is. So firstly, we'd like to acknowledge and recognise the traditional owners of Port Phillip Bay. And, Port Phillip Bay is really special part of sea country for the Bunurong and Boonwurrung people on the western and northern side of the bay, and also the Wadawurrung people on the western side. And just acknowledging that there is a really special connection to sea country, which has been alive for thousands and thousands of years, and really just wanted to thank First Nations people in these areas that have been caring for country for so long and giving us inspiration for how we can also tread lightly and do what we can to care for this really special ecosystems here. So 3 incredible speakers and followed by a Q&A at the end. So please, while our speakers sharing their wisdom and knowledge and passion, please feel free to pop any questions you have along the way in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And we will endeavour to answer them at the end. We will probably likely finish a little bit over 7, so just in case you had something after, maybe you can put it off or bring your dinner and eat it along to listen to that Q&A session. Also, tonight's session will be recorded and we will be sharing that afterwards. So without further ado, sorry, I've got this dog here, which is being very noisy, so I don't know if anyone can hear that. I'm going to hand it over to Paul now from LSB to introduce our amazing speakers.
Thanks, Shannon. I too would just like to also welcome our friends and volunteers from around Port Phillip Bay, those associated with Lifesaving Victoria, Victorian National Parks Association, and councillors and officers and friends of the Association of Bayside Municipalities. So we're thrilled to have so many people interested in the seminar series, and we warmly welcome you all. As Shannon said, 3 great guest speakers again tonight in this series. We're going to start off, and I'll just introduce Mark Rodrigue, who is a seasoned professional with over 25 years experience, currently serving as the program lead for Marine and Coasts in the Environment and Science Directorate at Parks Victoria. He plays a vital role in the Conservation and Planning Division. Mark is a dedicated marine and coastal specialist driven by a passion for education, fostering partnerships and building community stewardship for protected areas through effective management. His extensive expertise encompasses program development, program management and community engagement. Mark's commitment to preserving and enhancing our natural environment shines through in his impactful work. So thank you, Mark, and I will hand over to you. And I think we've got you on mute still, Mark.
Sorry about that. It's my first shout. Yes, thank you very much for the warm introduction, Paul. Obviously, my LinkedIn profile is doing a very good job of getting info about who I am. But no, thank you very much to VNPA and the team for inviting Parks Victoria and myself to present to you tonight on Port Phillip Bay's marine natural values. I get the good gig because I get to show all the interesting pictures of really pretty things under the water. So hopefully it'll also help provide a background and context for what our next two speakers from APA are going to be talking about as well. But let's kick straight off and get into it. Again, like Paul and Shannon, I'd like to start by paying my respects to traditional owners across Victoria, and in my case, I'm speaking to you from Wadawurrung country down in Bowen Heads. Let's get into these things, and first but not least, let's just think about Port Phillip Bay itself. Where does it sit in the global ocean? Clearly, we're on the southward-facing coast of Australia, a very large island surrounded by water. And in our own case here in Victoria, we've got a southward aspect looking to the Southern Ocean, to the south and the southwest, and over on the eastern part of the state, we've obviously got the edge of the Pacific Ocean. In terms of Port Phillip Bay itself, clearly an enclosed body of water, a tiny little opening down at Queenscliff and Portsea, the Rip, as it's known, which provides the total way for water to flow into and out of Port Phillip Bay. And an image like this one, a satellite image from Google Earth, just shows us particularly that entrance section of the bay, how dynamic it is. You can see quite clearly big drifts of sand there. This area is known as the Great Sands. The little block in the middle there is actually where Mud Islands actually sticks out of the water. We'll come across and talk about some of these values a little bit later on. But it's an interesting image because you do start to see sort of a bit of the variation in the depth of the bay itself. But better than Google, we've got this wonderful resource called CoastKit. And CoastKit is a Victorian Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Change mapping tool, which allows you to actually explore a whole range of data and information in relation to Victoria's coastline, including obviously for Port Phillip Bay. So this image of the bay is actually just simply showing the bathymetry again, or the depth. You can see again clearly here this area around the Great Sands being a very shallow area. Some interesting little features that may or may not be appearing on your screen, like some of the rivers and the way that the water flows into the deep parts of the bay in the centre here. You can also see some of these little shallow sections of the bay around Williamstown, around Geelong, the Geelong Arm, which again, that sort of big, large intertidal mudflats and things like that are there. Another great set of data on CoastKit is the habitats map. This is using a classification system, so it's a bit techie, but at the same time, it does give you a pretty clear picture that there's a lot of diversity. The different colours that you can see on the screen there do in fact represent different types of habitats based on largely the type of bottom material that happens to be there, whether it's solid material or it's shifting sands, mud, etc. That tends to provide the base for a whole lot of different marine communities. And it's a great little map to be able to go and inquire. And again, like all of these map tools, you can zoom in or go and find your favourite snorkeling or diving place and find out a bit more detail about what's going on there. The other thing that I just wanted to quickly point out to you, and I'll come back to this point in the next slide, is the marine protected areas. Parks Victoria is very proud to manage and have been managing a system of marine national parks and sanctuaries across Victoria for the last 20 years, with our 20th anniversary last year. On this image, you can see in the southern part of the bay, in the pink, you've got the Port Phillip Heads Marine National Park with its 6 quite discrete components of Point Lonsdale, Point Nepean, Swan Bay, Mud Islands, Portsea Hole and Pope's Eye. But up in the northern section of the bay, you'll be able to see Point Cook, which is around about 290 hectares or so, compared with the 3,500 down at Port Phillip Heads. Over here at Ricketts Point, we've got 115 hectares protected around that beautiful headland and intertidal reef. And then right up the very northern section of the bay is the Jawbone Marine Sanctuary, just near Williamstown, where Corroy Creek comes out of the bay, which is a little tiny one, about 30 hectares. But these representative areas are protected areas that provide essentially full protection for the animals and plants that live within them, just like our national parks do on the land. These places are set aside for the benefit of biodiversity and for conservation, and of course to provide opportunities for visitors to enjoy them where that's compatible. Their activities are compatible with looking after the things that live there. The key message for these marine protected areas is that they are no-take areas, just as our national parks on the land are. So let's dive straight into into looking at basically the habitats across Port Phillip Bay, and I've really taken that approach of splitting the habitats up, but based on the type of material or substrate that they happen to be on. So we're going to start off with rocky reefs for a start. Our solid real estate, our hard real estate, is pretty popular in the bay. There are a lot of animals and plants that need to attach themselves to something. They don't particularly like drifting around. And as you can see in this beautiful shot taken at Mushroom Reef, just down off Flinders, we have these fantastic intertidal reef platforms, which I'm sure many of you spend great times exploring. But to go one step beyond and into the bay itself, we can talk about those rocky reefs being in shallow waters where there's plenty of sunlight. Those reefs then support a really broad diversity of different types of marine algae. In particular, one group of the algae, the brown algae, the large brown algae, or kelps, actually form a habitat in their own right that we tend to refer to as kelp forests. And these are just like forests on the land, really rich places with lots of smaller plants that might be living beneath them, beneath the big canopy forming species, but also a huge range of animals, fish and other things swimming in the water column, hiding in amongst the blades of the trees, but also invertebrates that be crawling around on the base or stuck to the substrate itself. I'm very pleased to be able to share with you tonight some footage of what some of these habitats look like. Last year, as part of our 20th anniversary, we commissioned a wonderful young filmmaker, Jack Breeden from Lacelid Productions, to collect some footage of the bay sanctuaries and parks. And he's come back to us with this magnificent collection of things. And I'll be showing you a bit of Jack's work today. But just appreciating that these kelp forests are really rich, dynamic places and some of the most complex areas for biodiversity within the bay itself. Heading a little bit further down into the water itself, you've got places where there is not a great deal of sunlight. That can be relatively in the shallows where there might be a ledge or a rock overhang that protects, shelters things underneath there from sunlight. But certainly in the deeper waters where sunlight doesn't reach all that easily, you get an incredible explosion of invertebrate life, many of which are quite colourful and beautiful. These images are actually taken around the Port Phillip Heads area. In the background, there's a sponge, and sitting on top of it is a beautiful yellow zoanthid, but really provides a lot of colour and diversity in terms of our underwater environments. A nudibranch, a beautiful nudibranch for here, feeding on some of those sponges, or in this case, in feeding on cnidarians, or the stinging cells or stinging tentacles of sea anemones. You've got animals like beautiful cuttlefish and wonderful creatures like this particular one, a fish called the blue groper. A magnificent photo from Miriam. This is a fish species that VNPA and volunteers across Victoria discovered back in 2011 as part of the Great Victorian Fish Count. I'm really pleased to have that now as a protected species here in Victoria. But again, to show you just a little bit of Jack's wonderful vision, these deeper water reefs are really an explosion of colour. In my mind, they're as spectacular or even more spectacular than places like the Great Barrier Reef, and something we often like in Victoria to say to our Queensland friends that a lot of our species are actually unique. They're not common like many of the things found in Queensland. Apologies to any Queenslanders that might be listening. But in terms of looking at these places, they are really quite extraordinary. Many of the animals and plants that live in these deeper environments attached to the substrate are filter feeders, relying on the movement of water back and in and out through the heads. You've got a very strong tidal flows twice each day in two directions. So for the filter feeders, like these beautiful octocorals here, it's a fantastic place to live, and you just simply have to wait and the food comes to your front door. Really colourful environments. These parks areas also do protect species that people tend to like, perhaps to eat in some cases like this one here. Protected areas like marine national parks provide places for these things to grow up safely. And of course, there's a whole plethora of beautiful fish. My favourite fish in Victoria, the blue devilfish, being a really typical example of that. Let's move away then from the harder substrate environments into what we might call soft sediment environments. We're basically talking here about things like sand, mud, silt, the materials that basically aren't fixed on the bottom of the sea and do actually have quite often move from one place to another. Often seen as deserts, sandy environments can be actually quite rich in life, and in fact some of our greatest biodiversity records in Victoria come from sand in Gippsland. Here's a good example of you don't necessarily expect to see an eyeball looking at you from the sandy bottom. There could be something like a dumpling squid which covers its body in sand and hides down beneath the surface most of the day, coming out at night time. And if you've ever get the chance to see these things, particularly at night, they like little glowing things that move around. They're bioluminescent, and they are extraordinary little hunters that get out at night and feed. Here's another one, courtesy of Mark Norman's wonderful photo collection, one of the sand octopuses that, again, lives in the soft sands on the bottom of the bay. And to give you, again, a bit of imagery of what this stuff actually looks like, I've just, again, taken some of Jack's footage and cut it up. This is down over on the western side of the bay at Point Cook Marine Sanctuary. Moving in from the shoreline, you very quickly move out into some of these areas of sand. And in this particular area, it's really quite amazing to see the number of large ray-like animals, including these beautiful fiddler rays or banjo sharks and a whole bunch of smooth rays and other things as well that live in that environment. These animals really do like the sandy, soft environments because they can, as you can see in this one here, cover their bodies in sand. You've got animals like flounder that look very much like the sand, live on the bottom itself and wander around the place looking for little particles of things to eat for food. To look at what's actually going on the bottom of the bay in more detail, Parks Victoria and many organisations we do collaborative research with use what we call baited underwater, remote underwater videos, or BRUVs for short. This particular video footage was taken in the Port Phillip Bay National Park in some of the Great Sands areas, but it just simply shows you some of the diversity that you certainly wouldn't be able to see all that well if you were to either jump into the water with a diver or to put a camera down, just because of the disturbance. The little bait bag you can see there is attracting animals to come close towards it. A series of stereo cameras can actually help you to measure the size of the animals that are there, and it's a great way of being able to sample and understand what fish in particular that are living in your park without what people used to do back in the old days of putting a net through and dragging everything out. So really nice, gentle, soft tool for actually exploring diversity within the park. Soft sediments also include muddy areas as well. You can see some snails grazing on the small microflora that live on the top of the mud. Very productive marine ecosystems in the background. We've got some salt marsh. We have some interesting sort of softy, sort of hardy sort of sediment environments. This is actually an artificial one at a saltworks over near Avalon, where we're about to announce a very exciting project of returning a saltworks back into a coastal wetland. But for shorebirds like this little red-capped plover, these places are important for feeding and in some cases breeding as well. We've got mangroves that again rely on those soft sediment communities, have these fantastic breathing roots sticking up through the mud itself. And I'll just again share a little bit of vision of what this actually looks like. Again, not something that many people do think about is going snorkeling in a mangrove forest, but we've got them around the bay. They are really interesting places to have a look at. You can see in this image, for example, the productivity of those environments with little bubbles of oxygen heading on the way to the surface and keeping that whole environment nice and healthy, and a great place for invertebrates to attach themselves. At the back of the mangroves, and this is at the Jawbone Marine Sanctuary near Williamstown, there's some fantastic salt marsh remaining. A lot of this area was protected by the fact it was a former defence force, a shooting range, a rifle range, basically. So people wandering around that very likely get a fairly nasty and rude shock. But the protection afforded by this former use as a military area has meant that this is probably one of the most healthiest and intact areas left in the northern part of the bay. These areas also, soft sediments, are great places for seagrasses to grow. Seagrasses are quite different to the algae in the fact that they're a flowering plant that have evolved strategies for both living underwater. They do have flowers, and many of them have and produce seeds, but they again provide, like the kelp does, a fantastic environment, particularly for smaller animals. And we often talk about seagrasses as having a really important role as habitats for juvenile fish. Here's a little bit of vision from Jack again that just sort of shows some of the things that you might see. Again, the little bubbles of oxygen coming off the seagrass blades. Look at that rich and lush lawn that you've got out there. Well, it's not a lawn, it's a seagrass bed. But imagine all the little nooks and crannies and spaces that a juvenile fish or a pipefish, such as this fantastic bit of vision you've got here in front of you, can actually hide. So these places are great places and particularly important as nursery areas for many different species within the bay. Then, of course, we've got large sections of the bay which are what we call the blue layer, or the open water itself, and there's a whole community of things, sometimes here all year round, sometimes here seasonally, including things like jellyfish. We've been really lucky in the bay in recent times to be seeing more and more whales coming into the bay, and that's something pretty exciting during our winter months. We've obviously got small groups of fur seals that are, again, increasing in numbers in Port Phillip, particularly in the southern end of the bay. Occasionally getting visitors like this gorgeous leopard seal that's having a rest on a beach near Ocean Grove, actually, after probably doing a bit of a swim from somewhere in the Antarctic area. And again, in terms of just sharing some vision of what these fantastic marine mammals and things that use the open water, here's a couple of seals out at Popeside doing what seals do best, just hanging out under the water and enjoying life in that beautiful, clean bay environment at the entrance to Port Phillip Bay. So that was hopefully a little bit of a quick insight into why the bay is important, some of the very beautiful environments we have, and we are really, I think, fortunate as Victorians to have a park system that actually protects some of these representative areas within the bay itself. That's not to say these environments can operate and continue to survive without our help, and we've got a number of threats to Port Phillip Bay's marine protected areas, which I'm going to walk you through now. reasonably quickly. But again, an important thing to be thinking about is what can we do to assist in reducing the level of threats to Port Phillip Bay, whether it's what we're doing at home or what we're doing once we actually get down into the water. One of the big challenges for us is actually marine invasive species. These include a whole bunch of species are now present across Victoria, but particularly in Port Phillip Bay with its very important role as an international trading destination. So species like, for example, Undaria or the Northern Pacific sea star Asterius are very, very common now in Port Phillip Bay, not so common outside of the bay. And one of our big challenges is how do we prevent spread of these species from the bay to other places. We also have a number of species now which are starting to pop up that are invasive in the sense that they're causing dramatic change, but are actually not introduced species. These are actually native species that are being spurred on by changes in their environment. In this particular case, we're talking specifically about sea urchins, but there are a couple of other species like the Sydney octopus mentioned there that are changing their range as a consequence of warming waters down the east coast of Australia. Here's a good example of sort of 40 minutes worth of work at Pope's Eye a few years ago, collecting sea stars. An example of one of our ranger staff, Nikki Philby, one of Shen's mates, collecting Undaria over at Portsea Hole to try and control its and limit its spread. And just to, again, put that context of not the non-introduced species, the native species, here's sea urchins at Point Cook Marine Sanctuary. You can see some of them wearing little hats. I'm not sure why, perhaps because they've got nothing else to put on their heads. They like to put bits of shell on top. But you can see clearly the impact of those urchins has been to literally strip every single blade of seagrass, of every single bit of kelp out of those environments. And we've got a huge project working with Deakin University, Melbourne University, and Deakin at the moment to try and restore some of these habitats back to kelp forests. That's for another story, Shannon, another night. Illegal fishing continues to be a problem. While most Victorians are very supportive of our marine protected areas and do the right thing, fish and invertebrates are actually wildlife, and they are protected in all our marine protected areas with some very significant penalties for people who do the wrong thing. We put a lot of effort into trying to make sure these areas are well understood through website information, signage on site, and in more recent years, we've developed a piece of work that contributes to the Recreational Fishing Guide app, which I hope that you have on your phone if you're a fishing person. This gives you a very clear picture of where you are in relation to the marine protected area by pressing the little button that says, can I fish here? In the example, we're talking about Point Addis Marine National Park. The little dot represents where the boat was at the time, open fishing. Approaching the boundary of the park gives you a warning that you need to look out for other information. And when you're in a park, a big red message says, don't do what you're about to do. So great tools and something that helps us to be able to protect the wildlife, particularly the fish and invertebrates, from being taken through fishing. Water quality is something no doubt our next couple of speakers will talk about it in far more detail. But I think when you look at an image like this one, where you've got some dolphins and in the backdrop you can see the outline of the city of Melbourne, the bay is very much the recipient of everything that happens on land. I often describe the bay or some of our marine protected areas as a big puddle at the bottom of the hill, and whatever happens on the hill happens to the bay. So again, thinking about those connections between the bay and what we do on land in the catchments is a really important thing. One of the big challenges coming from urban environments are nutrients from things like dog poo, fertilisers, detergents, etc. that can change habitats from something that looks like this very healthy bit of seagrass to this unfortunate looking bit of seagrass. I took this photo at Mud Islands a couple of years ago, just really showing something that is causing great stress to the seagrass itself. Eventually that seagrass will die, and again that habitat then's lost. So again, an important one to be thinking about. Pollution also includes, and again EPA's remit, but I'll just mention it in terms of the work Parks Victoria does. We have a big program on the Yarra River to try and reduce plastics entering the bay with the Yarra litter barges that I'm sure many of you have seen operating. But it's not always coming from the catchment. Sometimes it comes from the air. A campaign at Zoos Victoria and Phillip Island Nature Park have run successfully is trying to stop people from releasing balloons into the environment. That little balloon up the top there you can probably work out the corporation doing this major event, was a balloon on Mud Islands in the middle of a seabird colony. So not good news for birds and particularly for their chicks. We've got material that comes off boats and from other sources. And altogether, these things contribute to a real challenge for marine life, many of them. This is a close-up of some sand. And you can see if you look closely, things like these blue and white little round circles there. They're preformed plastics or nurdles as such. There's some other fragments of God knows what there. But all of these things together, can start to look a little bit like something tasty for a seabird or a fish that might like to eat things like fish eggs. And in this example, this is out at Mud Islands. We've got a white-faced storm petrel, which has lined its nest with some glad wrap. Really exciting stuff. And some of those bigger things are obviously front of mind when we see animals really in distress from things that have come from another place and really shouldn't be in the bay. Lastly, I just want to finish up just a quick look at how we can connect with the bay itself. There's lots of opportunities for people to get involved in helping to look after and protect our marine protected areas. We've got 3 wonderful friends groups, the marine care groups at Point Cook, at Jawbone and at Ricketts Point, that always looking for new members and doing great and exciting things. So just encourage you to think about opportunities to get involved as volunteers. Some of the things that volunteers get involved with include monitoring. Here in this case, we're looking at seagrass monitoring out at Mud Islands. It's part of a Parks Victoria program, or looking, and here's a wonderful group of citizen science enjoying being a scientist and enjoying being in the environment, collecting seagrass data. So yeah, but it is good fun as well as being useful information. Quick plug for activity that's VNPO running at the moment. The Great Victorian Fish Count is on now. This is taken at Point Cook a few years ago, but another wonderful way of connecting directly with the bay by assisting in doing surveys of our local fish populations. And again, as mentioned, many volunteer groups, not only in the bay, but around the coast as well, occasionally get together. Every couple of years have been getting together. This event was down at Summers a few years ago, and we call this one Sharing the Love. And it's really about volunteers connecting with each other and sharing their great innovations and ideas and passion for the marine environment. And lastly, I just wanted to say, if you want more info on any of this stuff, our website's a great source of info. I just put this little clip to sort of show you what you can actually find on Parks Victoria's Marine Protected Area pages, some fantastic videos, stories of different parts of the state. And we've done a lot of work on that over the last 12 months. Special features that look at particular things. You can get individual park information, so things from the park note, the management plan, as well as what lives there. And again, we've got also a webinar series, all of which is on that MPA page if you're interested in discovering more. So thank you so much, Shannon, for the opportunity to speak tonight. And thank you very much to all of the volunteers who are listening tonight, or people who actually make an effort in trying to look after and protect our marine environment, and importantly, our marine protected area system. Shout out to the wonderful photographers who've contributed the many things to this. And in terms of the video, as I said, off the list there, Jack Breeden and Lacely Productions, some fantastic work there, and really looking forward to sharing more of that information with you sometime soon. Thanks, Shannon.
Thanks, Mark. Fantastic
Thanks, Paul,
presentation.
sorry.
That's
Paul
all right.
Shannon and Shannon Hurley. It's a bit confusing sometimes.
Yeah, we're the Shannon squared team. So
excellent.
It is definitely confusing, and just to reiterate those words on the fantastic work of volunteers, and I think collaboratively, if we bring those volunteers that are looking at beach safety with those looking at beach environment together, it can be a win-win situation. So thanks very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Alastair Hirst, an esteemed environmental scientist with an impressive background. Armed with a PhD and boasting 22 years of experience in marine, estuary and freshwater environments, Alastair has dedicated his career to providing scientifically sound advice to natural resource managers. His expertise shines through, especially in the design and analysis of monitoring programs aimed at detecting human impacts on our ecosystem. Currently serving as a marine science advisor at the Victorian EPA, Alastair brings a wealth of knowledge gained from his previous roles as a research fellow at Deakin University, Geelong, and a senior research scientist at the Department of Primary Industries. His research interests are diverse, spanning seagrass, fish, and invasive species ecology. Notably, Alastair has delved into the impact of the millennium drought on coastal ecosystems. Get ready to delve into the wealth of insights that Alastair Hirst will undoubtedly bring to our webinar as he shares his extensive knowledge and experiences in the realm of environmental science. Welcome, Alastair.
Thank you, Paul. As I share my screen. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thanks for turning out tonight. It's a bit like COVID all over again. And thank you, Mark, for a wonderful introduction to Port Phillip Bay. It's going to be very, very difficult to compete with all those beautiful pictures and videos. But I think the EPA is in a good position to talk about long-term change in the Bay, because we've got a monitoring program that's been running in the Bay since the 1980s. And so there we go. So let's start with some basics. So water quality can mean different things to different people. For example, if you're interested in managing the safety of water for drinking or swimming, and Miriam will touch on this later, you're likely going to focus on very different aspects than those that are setting water quality standards for bays or rivers. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the physical and chemical properties of water that support ecosystem function. But when they occur in excess, or in some cases where there aren't sufficient amounts, they may cause harm to the environment. So nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus are a good example. So without nutrients, there would be no primary productivity in the bay. That's the conversion of sunlight to organic material. That's the basis of the food chains. This sustains biodiversity and all the things that you saw in Mark's photos and videos, and things like fisheries production. So if you enjoy catching a whiting or a flathead on the weekend, that is dependent on some level of nutrients entering the bay and underpinning the food webs and fisheries production in the bay. However, sometimes you can have too much of a good thing. So the right-hand image here demonstrates what can happen when nutrients occur in excess. This is a photo of a blue-green algal bloom, in this case from the Gippsland Lakes in last April 2022. And these blooms occur because there's a buildup of, in this case, phosphorus in the bottom layers of the lakes, which mixes with the surface water during the summer months, and it fuels these enormous algal blooms. When the algae die through microbial decomposition, that uses up lots of oxygen and reduces oxygen levels in the water. And this can lead to fish deaths. And blue-green algae also produce toxins, which cause a whole range of other problems, including contamination of shellfish for human consumption. So this can be really problematic. The picture on the left is an image of the mouth of the Yarra River and Hobson's Bay, and it shows a large river plume associated with a flood event. So the plume contains large amounts of sediments, as shown by the colour, the brown colour, but also nutrients and contaminants. And this can cause localised reductions in water quality in the bay. The sediments in particular reduce the clarity of the water and prevent light from penetrating to the bottom. So this can be harmful to bottom-dwelling plants like the seagrasses and algae that Mark showed before that require light in order to grow. And this probably explains why you don't get a lot of seagrass in Hobson's Bay, where water clarity tends to be an issue, but you get it elsewhere in the bay. Okay, so what are the drivers of water quality in the bay? Firstly, inputs, stuff that's coming into the bay. So that's nutrients, sediments, and contaminants. I'm not going to talk about contaminants in this talk because that would take up another talk. It's quite a complex issue, and there's not really a good synthesis of what's really going on at the moment. So I'm going to focus really on nutrients, and they come from four principal sources. The catchment, so that's rivers and creeks. The largest is the Yarra and Maribyrnong River catchment, which accounts for 70% of the freshwater inputs into the bay. The Western Treatment Plant, which is on the shore over here near Werribee. And this accounts for about half of the nitrogen that enters the bay. And it treats about half of all of Melbourne's wastewater. The other half goes to Bass Strait near Gunnedah, following treatment at the Southeast Treatment Plant. Stormwater drains also collectively account for a much smaller amount of the material going into the bay, but they may be locally quite problematic. And I think Miriam will probably talk about their influence on water quality. And finally, atmospheric deposition accounts for some of the pollution entering the bay. So that's some contaminants are airborne, and that's how they enter the bay, whereas other pollutants may be emitted by industry into the atmosphere and are returned to the bay via rainfall. So that's an important source of pollutants in the bay. The other aspect of water quality is to the extent to which pollutants are removed or assimilated by processes. And in the bay, potential pollutants are diluted by the huge volume of water in the bay. So that's why the Western Treatment Plant discharges into the bay and not into a river. The tides and the currents in the bay also help to disperse and mix these pollutants with cleaner tidal water entering from Bass Strait. So it's estimated that the entire volume of the bay is exchanged every 12 months. And there's also some flushing of nutrients out of the bay via this process. So this diagram that I'm showing here, it shows the major currents in the bay, including the major tidal currents in and out of the mouth, which influence the southern part of the bay, and the Yarra flows, which track down the northeastern shore of the bay. And the currents are principally driven by daily tides and winds. There are also a bunch of natural processes that remove nitrogen from the bay, principally via microbial action. So this one such process is called denitrification, and that's a process that returns nitrogen to the atmosphere that enters the bay. And that's an important process by how we remove nitrogen from the bay. Okay, so the EPA's Marine Water Quality Monitoring Program is probably the longest monitoring program in Victorian coastal waters, and perhaps one of the longest in Victoria. It's been running since 1984, so it's coming up to 4 decades. And in Port Phillip Bay, it includes continuous monthly sampling at 4 sites. We do use other sites, but they come and go depending on our needs. And at each of these sites, we measure salinity, oxygen, suspended sediments, nutrients, and chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is a measure of the amount of photosynthetic plankton in the water, such as algae. And in order to sample, we use this device, which is a Niskin bottle, and this allows us to collect water samples at depth using a trigger device. And then the water samples are sent off to a lab for analysis. And since 2012, we've also been using this device. This is a CCAT profiler, and this measures water quality parameters at a range of depths from the surface to the bottom. And this is how we measure salinity, also how we measure salinity and oxygen these days rather than in the lab. And it allows us to measure differences between the surface and the bottom waters. And surprise, surprise, marine waters are 3-dimensional and they behave differently at the surface and the bottom. The figure here is what it looks like for salinity, for example, in the Gippsland Lakes. So you can see depth on the vertical axis and salinity on the horizontal axis. And what you can see is salinity is far lower at the surface and much higher at depth. You can see this shape as you go down through the depth profile. And that's because in the Gippsland Lakes, the surface waters are highly influenced by lots of freshwater riverine inputs from the adjoining rivers. And the 4 long-term monitoring program sites reflect different aspects of the bay. So, for example, here Long Reef is located offshore of the Western Treatment Plant. You can see here, this is the complex here. Hobson's Bay is located in Hobson's Bay in the path of the Yarra Plume here. Corio Bay has historically had a lot of industrial contamination, so that's why that location is cited there. Whereas the central site is located in deeper water, away from known sources of pollution, and is influenced by greater tidal exchange from the mouth. And it's a kind of reference site for the other sites. Okay, so a lot has changed since 1984. So first off, Melbourne's population has increased by about 70% since 1984. So we've gone from 3 million to almost 5.5 million people, and you might have noticed if you're living in Melbourne, trying to drive anywhere. Melbourne's urban footprint has expanded considerably, particularly out to the west and also out down into the southeastern suburbs. And notably, Melbourne's climate has dried significantly. And I'm going to show you the first of a number of figures. So hang in there. So this is a plot of Melbourne's rainfall since the 1940s. And I'm showing it using what's known as an anomaly plot, and they're typically used for climate trends. So the grey bars that you can see, the grey bars above the zero line are above average rainfall years, and the grey bars below the zero line are below average rainfall years. And I've also included a 5-year moving average. And as you can see, Melbourne's rainfall has declined since the 1970s, with the two most recent decades dominated by dry periods, the millennium drought here and the most recent drought period before we had the most recent La Nina. So what we've noticed recently is that the climate's drying, and we're getting fewer average years and instead more extremes and more variability on climate. And again, you might have noticed that too. Okay, so I'm going to present some of the trends using these figures. So each of the panels is a trend at each of the 4 sites that I've shown before. So you've got Central, Corio, Hobson's Bay and Long Reef here. And you can see the trend, the annual trend down the bottom from sort of the 1990s and 1980s for 2022. And in this case, I'm looking at salinity. I'm showing you salinity trends here. And this is useful for understanding the influence of climatic variability because in a relatively enclosed bay like Port Phillip Bay, it provides a measure of the net freshwater inputs against evaporation. And so you can see the wetting and drying cycles at each of the 4 sites. So the salinity peaks, like these are indicative of prolonged dry periods where the catchment inputs decline and there's greater net evaporation. So the salinities increase over time. For example, during the millennium drought, this is the millennium drought peak you can see here at Corio and Central. And then the troughs are during the wetter periods where there's greater rainfall and catchment inputs. And so these troughs, that's the last major La Nina we had in 2010-11. The other interesting long-term trend is for ammonia. So ammonia is a form of nitrogen and it's used by plants, but it's also toxic to marine life, particularly in high concentrations. So you can see that ammonia levels have remained constant across all the sites except for Long Reef. And here you get, here there's been a dramatic decline in ammonia levels since 1990. And this is a good news story, and it does coincide with technological improvements in the way that nitrogen is treated at the Western Treatment Plant. So what they're doing now is they're producing less ammonia and discharging nitrogen in other less toxic forms. So that's a great story. The final plot I'll show is for phosphate. So it's a form of phosphorus, and it shows a very clear trend. So this figure was taken from a scientific talk that I presented at a conference, and the dotted line is a statistical linear trend, and the asterisk is up the bottom, the level of statistical significance. So phosphate is a species of dissolved inorganic phosphorus that's available for uptake by phytoplankton. And as you can see, phosphate levels decline significantly across all sites, although the slope of the decline does vary. And the most likely cause of this overall reduction in phosphorus is a reduction in phosphorus from the catchment coming into the bay over the past 3 to 4 decades associated with that drying climate. The steeper decline at Long Reef offshore of the Werribee treatment plant also indicates that there's some improvement in the way that phosphorus is treated and discharged by the Western treatment too. So this figure demonstrates overall improvements in water quality over the past 3 decades. The trend is similar for many of the other indicators, although not as clear, so I haven't shown them here in this talk. So if we just to wrap that up and summarize what we've found from this data, generally water quality has improved in Port Phillip Bay over the last 3 decades. That means there's reduced nutrients and sediments overall, and that means increasing water clarity. And this seems to be driven by drying climate and reduced catchment inputs. There are short-term reductions in water quality. They're caused by climate variability. So water quality can generally be poorer during the La Nina years, and you may have noticed it over the last couple of years, and after big rainfall events and following floods. However, it's not all good news. This just got reported yesterday, and in fact, this is a misreporting because it says the highest reported PFAS levels in the world found in rare dolphins off Victoria's coastline. In fact, if you look at the paper, what you'll discover is that the highest reported PFAS levels, which these are the forever chemicals that governments are trying to ban all around the world, the highest concentrations of PFAS were recorded in dolphins collected in Port Phillip Bay. So that indicates that there are ongoing issues and ongoing pollution issues in the bay that we still have to tackle. And if you want further resources, there's lots of good reports online. I haven't provided the links here, but the EPA does a report card annually looking at the health of Victoria's marine embayments and their respective catchments. The State of the Bays reporting, which is a few years old now, summarises a lot of knowledge about the state of Port Phillip Bay and Western Port. There's an environmental monitoring plan for the bay, which has an interactive dashboard that I think DECA supports. And also there's a recent State of the Marine and Coastal Environmental Report that covers a lot of these issues around water quality and biodiversity. So I'll leave it there so we can stay on track and have some time for questions at the end.
Thanks very much, Alastair. Some good and some bad in there, but I certainly feel better overall about having a swim out the front here at Port Phillip Bay. But it's about getting in the water in a smart way. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Miriam Jones. So Miriam will guide us through the EPA's water quality forecasting system, providing valuable information on how to interpret and utilise these forecasts for informed decision making. These forecasts covering primary contact recreational activities like swimming help us understand the potential risks associated with water quality. So get ready for an informative session with Miriam Jones, who brings a wealth of knowledge and practical insights to the table. So welcome, Miriam.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks, Al and Mark, for some fantastic presentations. So as Paul said, I'm going to be discussing water quality and human health as it relates to EPA Beach Report. So what is Beach Report? So we are EPA's recreational water quality monitoring program, and we monitor water quality around the bay to see if it is safe for recreational use specifically. So think swimming, boating, diving, anything which is going to get you out and about on the water, really. And when we're looking at water quality, we as a group are trying to answer one main question, which is it safe to swim today at the beach? We do this because though water quality in the bay, as Al said, is usually pretty good, Port Phillip Bay is right on the edge of what is now the most populated city in Australia, which can cause some water quality issues from time to time. And unfortunately, some of these issues can come along with some human health risks, including possible gastrointestinal-like illness after contact with poor water quality. So Beach Report monitors water quality to identify the times and locations where there may be heightened risk from water quality in the bay, and we notify the public when this may occur so people can make informed decisions about whether or not they want to go for a swim at a beach on any given day. And so though we at EPA coordinate and run the program, we do collaborate extensively with Lifesaving Victoria and the many councils and localities around the Bay which make up the Association of Bayside Municipalities to deliver up-to-date information about water quality to communities in these areas. Our program monitors 36 beaches across the Bay, all the way from Santa Casa in Queenscliff on the Bellarine Peninsula to Portsea and Sorrento on the Mornington side. So no matter where you are around the Bay, you can probably find a beach report site which is close to you. We've also been running the program for 30 years, with this summer actually being the anniversary of the original program launch in the summer of 1993 and 1994. The program has changed a little bit in this time, with some more sites being added, being expanded into a year-round program, and been moved away from water quality results being reported in the newspaper and through a telephone-based service to a primarily website-based service. But the idea of providing the community with up-to-date information about Bay water quality has always remained the key focus of the program during this time. So how do we actually monitor water quality? So on Beach Report, we look at water quality in two different ways. So firstly, we have our water quality sampling program, which you can kind of consider as actually measuring actual water quality at a particular location. And I've tried to symbolize that here with a ruler. And then we also run what we call a water quality forecasting service, where we predict future water quality. I'll talk a little bit about the sampling component first, and then I'll move on to the forecasting. So like I said before, when we sample, we're looking to measure what water quality was like on a particular day, at a particular time, at a particular beach. And so to do this once a week or once a fortnight, depending on the time of the year, we have a sampling team which goes out and physically measures water quality at a beach. And they do this by taking a reading of environmental indicators of water quality, like temperature, turbidity, salinity, which is what the man in the photo on the left is doing. And we also take samples to be analysed for bacterial water quality at our lab, which gives us an understanding of how likely water quality at a beach is to be a risk to human health. And when we get the results back, which are essentially numbers of bacteria in the water, this corresponds with some standards that we have, which tell us if the water quality was safe for swimming at the time of sampling. And because this sampling is quite expensive and the results from sampling take around 24 hours to be turned around to us, so there's a bit of a delay, we can't use the sampling to give us a day-to-day picture of what water quality is like at a given beach report site. So instead, alongside our sampling program, we run a water quality forecasting service, sort of like a weather forecasting service, which predicts what water quality will be like at beach report sites on a day-to-day basis. And to get this prediction of water quality, we take information about weather, recent sampling results, historical water quality at a beach, and any nearby pollution events, and input this information into a computer program, which gives us a water quality forecast every day for every beach around the Bay. And it's then these forecasts of water quality which are published on our website. Like you can see here, this is our beach report website map, and the forecast for each beach corresponds to a colour rating. So green for good and suitable for swimming, yellow for fair and may not be suitable for swimming, red for poor and not suitable for swimming. And these forecasts are also reported at beaches through Life Saving Victoria clubs. And we have Life Saving Victoria and EPA signage issued out on the beach showing the current forecast on weekends when the clubs are actively patrolling the beach. So next time you're at your local beach, have a look out for the Life Saving Victoria signs with the dial showing what the water quality is today. And I've also got a video here which explains the forecasting process very succinctly and gives some information about our website services. So I'll just hit play on that as well.
Looking to escape the heat? Our beaches and rivers provide a cool escape. But is the water quality okay for swimming today? It's easy to check on your phone. Beach Report and Yarra Watch provide forecasts every day in summer for many beaches in Port Phillip Bay and locations along the Yarra River. Water quality is rated as good, fair, or poor. Good means the water is probably safe for swimming. Fair means the water might be affected by pollution, so you might decide not to swim or avoid swimming at beaches with stormwater drain outlets. Poor means the water is probably not safe for swimming. So this summer, enjoy swimming. Just remember to always check the water quality at epa.vic.gov.au/summer water.
So one thing that video doesn't go into as well is that we also have a SMS service which you can subscribe to for free that sends you a text when a poor water quality forecast is issued at your local beach. So you can just sign up for that by going to the EPA website. And after all that, I'm sure you're wondering what water quality is like in Port Phillip Bay. And the good news is that the vast majority of time, the water quality is actually really good and safe for swimming at all beaches around the bay. And we have around 93% or more of our samples come back as meeting the safe standard for swimming. When we do see poor water quality, it's usually due to one main thing, which is stormwater pollution after rain. So this is the biggest challenge for us when it comes to water quality in the bay. And you can kind of think about it as every time it rains, all of the litter and muck and dirt on the street gets picked up and channeled into the stormwater drains and rivers, which discharge straight into Port Phillip Bay and our beaches. So at EPA, we advise that the public avoid swimming for 24 to 48 hours after rain, and to avoid swimming near river mouths and drain outlets when they're discharging after rain. And again, there's a video from our website which explains this quite nicely.
Our beaches and swimming spots are usually good for swimming, but can sometimes become polluted. Why is that? Stormwater runoff is the most common cause. During and after rainfall, water that falls around our roads washes things like chemicals, feces, and rubbish into our bays and rivers. Children, older people, and those with weakened immune systems are most at risk of getting sick from polluted water. So before you enjoy our many great swimming spots this summer, remember to check the water quality from your phone. Simply visit epa.vic.gov.au/summer water.
And a really extreme example of this stormwater pollution following rain happened during the floods in spring last year. And I'm sure everybody remembers the La Nina event last year, which caused massive amounts of flooding and rainfall and huge amounts of stormwater to be carried by drains and rivers into Port Phillip Bay. And I've got this GIF here, which shows the extent of the impact quite well. So these are satellite images of the mouth of the Yarra River before, during and after the floods. And you can really clearly see the massive plume of brown water extending out of the mouth of the Yarra during this time, and the impact that this had on nearby beaches. So you've got Sandridge in this corner here, and then Port Melbourne leading out from towards the southeast corner of the screen there. You can just see the beaches being essentially affected by this plume of brown water and the clarity decrease, leading to water which I'm sure everyone remembers looking like that picture on the left here. And though it's an extreme example, last summer really clearly shows to me how fluctuations in weather and climate can drive impacts to water quality in the bay. So this is a bit similar to what Alastair said in the previous presentation, but weather is like one of the most important drivers of water quality. And in contrast to last year, this upcoming summer might be very different to last year, with an El Nino event tracking at moderate strength as forecasted by BOM, which may actually result in below average rainfall for Victoria this year. And there may be reduced frequency of wet weather related water quality issues this summer, which is good news if you want to go swimming this summer. But hot weather does come with some other risks for water quality, including algal blooms, which occur in Port Phillip Bay almost every summer. And the most common kind of bloom that we get is noctiluca, otherwise known as red tide or sea sparkle. And it has this reddish pinkish color that you can see in the picture on the left. And this is one that I spotted last year at St Kilda Beach on a hot day in December. So that's, yeah, just an example of what it looks like. Our red tides are generally a low risk algal bloom, but they can cause mild skin irritation in some people. So we do advise that both humans and pets avoid contact with the water when they occur. They're usually pretty short-lived and dissipate with tides and good weather. However, they're a good thing to keep an eye out for when you're out and about at the beach this summer. The highest risk period for them is when there's a period of hot weather after rain. And this is because the rain washes all kinds of things that the algae like to eat into the water. And then the hot weather provides an ideal temperature for them to grow. And our beach report will also change a water quality forecast to fair if we receive reports of an algal bloom at a beach. So if you find one, you can always report the pollution to us on the EPA hotline in the bottom left of the screen. And that's it from me, really. The final things which I just want to reiterate are remember to check the beach report website before swimming this summer, and to keep an eye out for any water quality changes reported on the Life Saving Victoria beach signs before going in. Also that our SMS service is available if you'd like the latest info on poor water quality on your phone. And if you see any signs of pollution like algal blooms out and about, you can report them to EPA on our pollution hotline. And
Thanks.
That's it from me.
Thanks very much, Miriam. And it's a good showcase of what we can achieve with collaboration between, different organisations to be getting, public safety messaging out. So thank you to all speakers, and I will just hand back to Shannon now in regards to some of those questions that were put into the chat, Shannon. So I know a few were answered in the course of the presentations, but are there any glaring for any of our speakers?
Yes, there are, Paul. So we might start off with Mark. So we've got one from Wendy, which is, how can we stop recreational fishing hugging the boundary of Ricketts Point Marine Sanctuary as so fragile, and I think it stresses her out as a snorkeler seeing them so close, and are drones used?
Thanks, Wendy. And I've actually tried to respond in the text, but I'll have a crack at doing it verbally as well. So seeing fishes lined up along the boundaries of marine protected areas is actually quite common, not just here in Port Phillip Bay, but around Victoria. I know down at Warrnambool, the Miriam Marine Sanctuary often has lines of crapots that basically sit on the edge of the park boundary. And with the, I guess the perception that there are good things inside the park that might decide to come out. And, in the case of fish or large invertebrates like rock lobsters, that's definitely well and truly on the cards. For me, it's actually not a problem so much of seeing them on the boundary or outside the boundary, but it's actually when you see them inside the boundary is a really big problem. And this is where, again, community keeping observant, reporting activities, illegal activities. It is illegal fishing. To the authorities, whether it's to Parks Victoria or to call Victorian Fisheries Authority on 13FISH, 13FISH, is the best thing that observers can do. When fishers are actually fishing outside the park, recreational fishing is a legal activity in Port Phillip Bay, and until that changes, people will continue to fish in the areas. The importance of having protected areas where there is no fishing, however, is really so that the species that live there, be they fish, be they rock lobsters, be they sea urchins, be they whatever that people like to take, get the opportunity to grow up in relative safety where they're not being harassed or not being taken before they reach their prime of life. And it's a good thing to see the fishes outside the boundary. Yes, it's a little bit disconcerting, but at the same time, understand that if you're seeing them outside the park, that means they're not in the park, which is a good thing. And sorry, Shen, the second part of the question was about drones, I think. Use of drones for compliance work. Look, I'm not sure, Wendy, that I've actually seen or heard of. I don't think Parks Victoria use it for compliance in the fishery space. I know we've been using drones a lot in the last couple of years for illegal detection of firewood harvesting, for example, or illegal hunting in many of our terrestrial parks. But it's a good idea. I might take that one on board and find out a little bit more about whether fisheries actually use drones at all within the parks. But certainly great tools. And again, if they're useful, bring it on.
Great, thanks, Mark. And I've just noticed you've been answering the questions as you go. So thank you very much for doing that. But I think you've answered the rest of them. So if anyone else wants to see the answers to other people's questions for Mark, just check out the chat. So we've got a couple of questions now for Alastair and Miriam now. So I might just ask the questions and then leave it to you, whoever wants to answer them. So can we reduce runoff into the bay by eliminating concrete, creek and storm drain channels feeding the bay?
Do you want me to answer that one, Miriam?
Yeah, happy for you to answer that one.
So I think the trick with runoff is to remove the contaminants and the sediments. It's hard to stop the water from getting back into the bay, gravity being what it is. So what Melbourne Water is responsible for a lot of this work in Melbourne, in the Yarra catchment. And so what they do is they build, you've probably seen them, they build wetlands, so artificial wetlands. And so they're designed to slow the water. They often use a lot of aquatic vegetation to do this. And what that does is that they slow the flow. The plants themselves are a physical barrier, and what that does is it allows the sediments and the contaminants to settle out of the water and actually deposit in the wetlands themselves. So these wetlands can become quite toxic and contaminated themselves. And then for them, there's a process of actually having to clean up and remove those contaminants at a later date. So that's one way of doing it, which is to put in more artificial wetlands or natural wetlands, if possible, into some of our creeks and rivers to prevent those contaminants from actually reaching the bay.
Great, thanks, Alastair. And maybe another one for you as well. This is one from Charles, who he's asking, do toxic materials from waste incinerators have any effect on marine ecosystems?
Yeah, I don't really know. Is he referring to industrial processes?
Yeah, I think there's a project around Geelong, which I'm not across the details of it.
So the EPA, so the EPA is an organisation who licenses all waste discharges, be they to water, to land, or to the air. So what we try and do is minimise those impacts to the environment. So, we would require a company to have a plan or to minimise their discharges, or where there is a discharge of toxic materials or other pollutants, they discharge it to a place which has less impacts. So a lot of pollutants go to landfills that are designed to treat and retain those toxic contaminants. But yeah, there's unfortunately a lot of our industrial pollution does end up in our waterways, but a lot of residential pollution ends up in waterways as well. So in that way, we're all partly responsible, and we could all collectively do better than we are. Yeah.
Thank you. And this isn't one from Lynn, who's interested in the waste from cruise ships and where they go. And so I'm not sure how much.
Yeah, that's a much easier one because they are required. Obviously, cruise ships have their own wastewater systems, and they're quite technologically advanced, and they treat their wastewater systems. But even after you treat the wastewater, there's still there's still some residue, and so that's supposed to be deposited back on land. And in fact, most ports have facilities to allow cruise ships and large ships to do that. And so I think that goes straight into grey water and sewage system and is treated eventually at the Melbourne wastewater treatment plant. So that's where that would go. And then that goes for all other vessels. They're not, by law, they're not allowed to discharge into marine waters. That's illegal and can result in criminal penalties. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. We've got another one. This one's perhaps for Miriam. Is water quality measured on some of the popular ocean beaches?
Not by EPA as part of Beach Report. So we focus on Port Phillip Bay. I do know that some of the councils in some of the ocean beach areas are doing some water quality monitoring, but it's not reported with EPA and not affiliated with us.
No problemos. And there's another one which is probably for either of you is there a reason why there's no monitoring site on the southeastern side of Port Phillip Bay?
Actually, there is. There's one at Dramana, but it's not a long-term site. So I think it's only been running since the early 2000s. So yeah, so in order to look at longer-term trends, I haven't included the data for that. But yeah, we do have a current one at Dramana. We've had others over the years as well at other locations in the bay. Yeah.
Yep, that makes sense. And then Sandra is asking around the beach report. So this one's for Miriam. So if the beach report is mostly now on the internet and not so much on the radio, how are people educated about the existence of it? I think you covered that a fair bit in your talk, but if you've got any other questions there or any other points to add.
Yeah, so it's not only on the internet. That's where we primarily have most of our in-depth information, but we also operate our SMS service. And then occasionally during bigger events like the floods, we'll have spots on radio or TV about our program. So there was quite a bit of coverage, I think, in December and January about Beach Report.
Great, thank you. We've got Gerard who says, thanks, Miriam, just signed up for the SMS notification. So that's great. Rod is asking, is the source species of bacterial contamination determined, i.e. is it human, canine, other?
Yes, we've actually been doing quite a lot of research in this space over the past few years. These kinds of results haven't been released on our website as part of the regular program, but we've been doing some more in-depth investigations with Monash University. And what we've found is that most of the bacteria is actually it depends on the beach, but it's often from dogs or birds, which is actually good news as these are lower risk sources of bacteria than, say, human.
Great, amazing, thank you. We'll just take a couple of more given the time. So just quickly, one from Catherine is, how can we best improve the water quality of our waterways into the bay?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. So I mentioned wetlands is one way of doing it. The way in which we, so some of the nutrients that enter the bay are from agricultural sources. So there are maybe improved ways of utilizing fertilizer that reduce, which result in less of it ended up in waterways. The use of riparian vegetation is also a way of reducing pollutants and nutrients getting into waterways. The people who run the wastewater treatment plants, which is Melbourne Water, have spent a lot of money, many millions of dollars, on improving the technologies they use to treat the wastewater we all generate. And so as I showed, that's resulted in improvements in the quality of water that's discharged from my wastewater treatment plants. So that's some of the ways that we can improve it. There's also a whole range of contaminants, like chemicals, that go in there. And I think that the trick there is to identify the sources of those contaminants in, be they residential or industrial, and actually stop them at, or the discharge of those contaminants at the source. And that can be really tricky. So the chemical that I mentioned at the end, the PFAS in dolphins, that's really only emerged as a problem in the last decade. The chemicals have been around for many, many decades, and it's only now emerged as a problem, and people realise what a problem it is. So identifying problems and stopping them at the source is probably also a way of improving water quality, but that can take some time to do.
Great, thank you. I've got one more from Mark. Mark, do you feel, maybe you've already answered this, tell me if you have. Sorry, just trying to juggle between a few things here. Do you have the staff to carry out compliance work over such a broad area?
Good question, Shannon. Is there enough? No, there could always be more. However, we try to direct, and I know this is similar to fisheries, we have information gathering opportunities, particularly through people reporting illegal fishing within parks, that tend to describe or set up patterns basically of behaviour that can then be used to inform a compliance plan. Some of you might be aware of a fantastic effort in compliance that happened at Ricketts Point, where there's some great social media footage if you want to search for it. I actually had a quick look for it earlier to try and respond to one of the questions I had, which actually shows the fisheries officer arriving, and it looks like about sort of 50 boats basically all scattering in different directions, many of which were actually photographed and followed up with later on. Are there enough people out there on the water from an agency perspective, whether it's fisheries or park staff? Probably not. But we also have many hundreds, thousands and millions of people who use our waterways, our bays, for their recreation, that are also compliance officers in the sense that they can report illegal activity. So while, yes, it'd be nice to have additional staff, additional boats and things like that to be able to undertake compliance work, we do rely on actually having a community that, one, respects the marine environment, that understands there are areas that we can set aside without fishing or without removing animals and plants for the benefit, potentially in the longer term, of fisheries. So that's one of the secondary benefits, I guess, of protected areas. They do provide opportunities for animals to do what animals do, make babies. And we certainly, in the case of rock lobsters, are really confident that they are protected areas, provide huge benefits to the fishery, because the baby rock lobsters don't necessarily live next door to mum and dad. So look, again, bit of a long-winded answer, but no, there are not enough people on the water. We have to do with what we've got and what we're given. Your encouragement to government to provide more resources to agencies like Parks Victoria and EPA are welcome. EPA and Fisheries Victoria are most welcome, so please do. Just, if you think it's an issue, then raise that with your local member. But again, think about what you can do on an individual level to help report illegal activity by just getting on your phone, reporting on 13Fish.
Great, thank you, Mark. And we're going to have to leave it there, but sorry if your questions did not get answered, but if I can encourage you to perhaps, send them on to the general emails, maybe at Parks Vic and EPA, and maybe they'll be able to be answered at some point. But yeah, if you've got a burning question. I think that was a really great bringing together of the marine ecosystems and marine life and human health, and what are the good conditions for us to sort of thrive and be healthy, whether you are a fish or a human being swimming in the bay, and what are some of the challenges really around how we can continue to ensure that Port Phillip Bay remains healthy going into the future, and what are some of those challenges, and really the importance of community sort of working together, whether it is reporting an algal bloom or whether it's volunteering to really help to care for the bay's health. So Mark, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point. I was actually going to jump in when Alastair was talking a moment ago, of just being aware that while, yes, we do have some significant issues and challenges facing the bay at the moment, the bay is so much healthier than it was 50 years ago. Back in the past, in the dark old days, raw sewage, abattoir outputs, etc., all industrial outputs ended up in the bay without any sort of controls at all. So the quality of water in the bay has improved enormously. That's both for human health and for biodiversity. So it's important, I think, to take stock and recognise that we've gone a long way. Successions of good policy around protecting the waters of Victoria, the work that the EPA does in terms of legislation and also in enforcement has been, it's been transformational in terms of the health of Port Phillip Bay. So yes, while we do have some issues, please don't think that the bay is a basket case. The bay has improved enormously over the last 50 years or so, and a lot of that comes down to communities being aware of the importance of bay values and agencies and government working together to try and improve policy around water quality.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for that important point. I just wanted to thank each of the speakers. So Mark, it's always, you're so passionate and dedicated to your job, and I always love hearing you speak and sharing your knowledge of the marine ecosystems, which are really special, and the work that Parks is doing to continue to monitor them and reduce the threats there. And that was a really good base to what is actually down there, to leading into Alastair's talk. And it was really great to put some of those pieces together around water quality and the climatic changes and the variables that can really impact those and what's happening in the bay. So thank you very much for your talk. And Miriam, obviously the human health element is so important too. So thanks for telling us and sharing a bit more about what the EPA is doing and how people can really get on board with knowing that information. So thank you to each of you very much for your passion, and everyone in the audience, if you can please join me in sending these speakers a bit of love and gratitude for sharing with us tonight. And thank you, Paul, for co-hosting this together with myself, and to Jacob, who you can't see him, but he's the tech behind everything. So thanks, Jacob, and thank you to you all for joining us. This webinar has been recorded and will be sent out to you shortly if you wanted to rewatch it or share it with others. But also, I did say at the very start that we were announcing something exciting, and that is as part of this grant that's been supported by the Victorian government. We're able to host a really cool field trip with Geography Victoria, and a date has been earmarked, so pop it in your diaries, Sunday the 4th of February. It's going to be with some expert presenters looking to explore the dynamic nature of coastal and marine ecosystems in the flesh around Port Phillip Bay, and focusing on the climate change impacts, mitigation and solutions along our coast, as well as the geological and geomorphological evolution of our coastline. We will be sending out details to this list if you have registered. There's only very limited spots, but get in quick if you want to come on that field trip. And I will leave it there. Thank you again, everyone. And we will have a third webinar at some point soon in the new year, so you will be notified of that one too. So have a lovely evening, and we'll see you later.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Paul.